Hello. Welcome back to Networks and Cybersecurity. Today we are looking at cryptography. And if you can read this, then you need to go outside more. Not actually a cryptographic mechanism there, but one way to encrypt your traffic against people who don't spend too much time on the internet. Anybody recognize that statement there? No. So cryptography is an interesting concept right now because it is very politically relevant. There are several fresh attempts to legislate cryptography in the US and in the EU. In the US, the argument focuses on the banning of so-called end-to-end encryption, which we will talk about in more detail later, hopefully, but the gist of the ban on end-to-end encryption is that a service provider, so somebody like Facebook, WhatsApp, whatever, can design their communication platform in such a way such that a couple of users can communicate over it, but Facebook, WhatsApp, whoever, and yes, I realize those are owned by the same parent companies, those are funny examples, but they can design their application in such a way that even they can't decrypt your communication. They're not saying that they do this now, but there are some applications that use end-to-end encryption, mostly enterprise products for communication. So I think Zoom in its premium paid version does this. Various different applications have end-to-end encryption already. And in that case, again, the service provider, the one over whose network the traffic is flowing, is unable to decrypt it. And the reason that many US companies are starting to do this is not because they value our privacy as citizens, it's because dealing with federal warrants is expensive and annoying, and it is much cheaper and more convenient to simply tell the Fed, well, here's the encrypted content of their two communications, or of the two parties' different communications. That's all we got, sorry. Have a nice day. Best we can do for you. That is much easier than having to comply with federal warrants. And if you operate in thousands of different nation states and cities and jurisdictions around the world, as companies like Facebook do, it becomes very, very annoying to comply with the warrants of all of those different organizations. So it's a very tempting prospect to just be able to tell them, sorry, we can't actually decrypt this communication. And remember, Facebook operates, as well as in the United States, in other countries that are far more likely to use these kinds of powers for nefarious means and basically tell Facebook, hey, if you don't decrypt this, we're going to kick you out of our country. Something that, for example, China tends to do to many different providers. Hey, if you can't decrypt traffic between two people that we don't like, just get out. That's basically the answer there. So that's why the debate has started again in the United States. And in the EU, I'm not sure why they're debating restricting cryptography again, but it's something that comes up every few years. Nations love to restrict cryptography as much as they can, for some reason. They always carve out an exception for themselves, though. Whenever cryptography is restricted, the state is always not restricted. They always get their own little exemption from those restrictions. When is it a good idea to encrypt your communications? As a developer, you should be aware of when it's a good idea, and the answer is almost always. So the answer in web, for example, when should I use HTTPS versus HTTP? HTTPS is the encrypted version of HTTP, essentially. So when should you use HTTPS? And the answer to pretty much anyone you ask is going to be almost always. There's no reason to use HTTP anymore. The overhead from encryption is tiny. on both the client and the server end, and occasionally it actually saves you some space because there's some compression involved. The overhead on the network is nothing because it's the same size over the network, basically. Maybe slightly larger, but not much. And there's a very small exchange of traffic to set it up, but not much. And the advantages are large because even completely innocuous information, like what people visit on your website, let's say you run a website called craftsoap.com, and you say, well, all we do here is talk about craft soap, so we don't need to encrypt anything. And that's probably fair. But if somebody was a political dissident and they also liked craft soap, and the state knew that they were a political dissident and also liked craft soap, and you fail to include encryption on your website, they may very well be apprehended because they visited your craft soap website and it was determined that this is a person who likes craft soap. We're looking for a person who likes craft soap, and we got him. So this so-called metadata and all these different things can be very useful for state actors and even for thieves, even though that's not necessarily sensitive. But more importantly, do you record everything that you say and do and post it on the internet? Do you record all of the documents that you view on your machine and tell the state that you're viewing them, all the images and things? Do you talk in such a way that the state and thieves and everyone else can hear what you're saying at all times? No, you have private conversations generally by virtue of knowing, because you are in a private space, that your communication is private. So if you are in your home, you pretty much assume anything you say is not being overheard. We have this natural expectation of privacy, and it's very difficult to translate it to the networks, the internet domain, because we don't consider that to be either our personal space, or we sort of forget that it is possible for people to listen over it. It's just different psychologically when traffic goes over the internet. But we should be able to have a private conversation in contexts other than in person. Especially because if you can't, then how are you even going to set up those in-person communications in the first place? And the answer to law enforcement that wants to listen to people's conversations is always the same. If you want to listen to people's conversations and you have a warrant to do so, then bug their house and listen to it, as we have always done for probably over 100 years at this point. There is no defending against the authorities taking a physical or private control over your device or your house or whatever and spying on you when they have a warrant, as they are entitled to do and as they should do. If you are accused of some crime, they need to collect evidence. This is how it's done, and that's how they should do it. The blanket collection of sort of all communication is usually not even particularly helpful, let alone, a good idea. So is there such a thing as a right to a private conversation online? Most people probably assume that there is. The folks that are in favor of banning encryption or banning private conversations online probably assume that the scope of this sort of ban would be relatively restricted, which is historically not the case. Once these kinds of bans are put into place, you can safely assume that every conversation is being watched. So if there is a sort of blanket restriction on private conversations online, then you will assume, or you should assume, that every conversation you participate in is watched, as it is, again, in countries that have these kinds of bans. So you can safely assume, for example, in China, that every single message you send on WeChat is at least processed by a machine, if not outright read by a human being for dissident-like behavior, depending on who you happen to be. So if encryption is banned or restricted, all conversations online become public. The government essentially listens to every conversation at will. Generally speaking, their will is to listen to all of them. To some extent, you would have no Fourth Amendment right online, as you don't particularly have too much of it now, but you would have none at that point. And this is the reason that nations in particular have tried to ban or subvert encryption since its earliest days. So when we talk about the problems with encryption in general, it is usually tied to problems with nations, not too often to thieves and bad actors, hackers of that sort, because they typically lack the resources to crack encryption. The usual pipeline is that a nation state, does something to subvert encryption. That information leaks out, and then it is used by hackers. And the reason this is usually the pipeline is that encryption is complex math, and a small rogue actor or a small group of rogue actors who are thieves or professional hackers, generally speaking, no matter how skilled they are, they just don't have the resources to defeat encryption. You do see occasionally flaws in encryption found by private people. Often you'll see it found by cybersecurity researchers or something. It is generally very rare for a problem with encryption or cryptography in general to be found by a single or small group of hackers, and then they use it for personal gain. Again, there's usually a pipeline. A nation state or a researcher finds it, and then it goes out into the hacking world. And this is how we have gotten some of the worst malwares over the years, is basically leaks from nation state-funded cybersecurity organizations. Let's talk about one of these cool organizations that was involved in the history of cryptography. Crypto AG is a very well-known organization in the field of cryptography. They're one of the first to invent cryptographic devices. It was a Swiss company. It's basically founded on the tail end of World War II. It's based off a company that's existed since the beginning of the 1900s. So they were already in some form of service even through World War II. They were founded basically to sell cryptographic devices to the U.S. military. At the time, computers obviously are not something that people have, so the kinds of cryptographic devices they sold, they kind of look like, if you've ever seen the Enigma device from World War II or something, it's basically like a typewriter, a bunch of gears and fun crap on it. You can type your message, it'll come out with an encrypted one. You basically get it on a piece of paper, you can send it out. That's the kind of stuff they made in the early days. Then later they moved on to more digital devices. I think they even made like fax machines and stuff. I think at some point they were making things like phones and different ways to send encrypted messages that were more modern. They're still relevant up through the 70s, 80s, 90s. Only in the 2000s do they sort of fall into obscurity and lose relevance. And they sell these machines all around the world, these secure cryptographic machines with their custom-made ciphers. They sell these to, of course, the U.S. military. They also sell these to post-war Germany. Remember, Germany was east and west. They sell it to our half. They sell it to Iran, to different banks all around the world, and then also to private entities like drug cartels started to seek these devices, knowing that they were very secure. They became relatively sought after. So they were selling it to governments and large organizations all around the world to communicate their encrypted messages. What was the problem with Crypto AG? The problem is that it was owned completely and wholly by the United States Central Intelligence Agency from 1970 and beyond. This was finally declassified in the mid-2010s after it was uncovered by a couple private news organizations. The CIA finally basically admitted it. Yep, we bought the company in the 70s, and we actually wholly owned it through there. The CIA owned it in secret. Most of the people who worked for it did not know that the CIA was the owner. And basically what the CIA did in order to kind of further the cause of the American Central Intelligence Agency was that they, when they were selling these products to places like Iran or other parties that they wanted to snoop on, they would sell them a flawed machine, or they would give them a flawed instruction manual or something along those lines. They would always integrate some sort of defect into the device that they sold so that they could spy on them. And so from the 1970s onward, the United States was able to read the messages of Iran and West Germany and all of these different places that they wanted to spy on. And they used this information for all kinds of cool historical events, like when the hostages were taken by Iran under Reagan. They were able to see the messages that Iran was sending around internally about that. When there were bombings by Libyans, I think in West Berlin, they were able to figure out that Libya was actually responsible based on the messages they were sending to each other. And eventually Iran kind of figured it out. So eventually Iran figures out that the only way that the Americans must have known about this thing, it was an assassination or something, and the only way Americans could have known about this thing was if they had some sort of backdoor into our encryption. So they kidnapped one of the crypto AG employees in Iran and, put the sticks to him, gave him a little torture or something. But he wouldn't talk because he didn't know that the company was owned by the CIA, and they eventually bail him out and let him go. So this is another cool intelligence agency thing, one of those plausible deniability things, right? They actually didn't even tell their own employees. But this shook the trust in encryption companies for the foreseeable future. And so this is why, or one of the main reasons why, you will always see a lot of accusations of any company that deals in cryptography, any private organization, and the sale of their cryptography or their cryptographic mechanisms will always face these accusations of being owned by the state, because in the past they were owned by the state in some cases. And so when you hear people talk about backdoors and encryption and this being owned by an intelligence agency, understand that it has a basis in history, and it is likely true of at least one organization out there today. Sometimes it's a little bit more blatant. You see, for example, a lot of talk about Tor, which is an anonymous browser that relies on encryption and all kinds of other mechanisms for anonymity. But of course, Tor is developed by DARPA, which is the Navy's research department, so it's not really hidden that Tor is developed by the state in this case. Sometimes this can be a good thing, depending on whether or not you trust the state to sell you the quote-unquote real version, because of course the state doesn't want their own messages to be read. But just something to keep in mind, that when people talk about all these hidden backdoors and stuff in cryptography, it is something that's happened before. And when we talk about why a particular kind of encryption is secure, one of the things we always have to think about is who made it and what are their biases, what do they want to do? Because we always want to think about who made it, as it might be somebody who deliberately wants it not to be secure. So before we get into more on crypto, let's look at some of the common terms that are used. So I'm going to use a lot of these terms in the coming slides. Hopefully you've heard some of these before, but maybe you don't know exactly what they mean. So the first term is plaintext. That's the thing that we are going to be encrypting, so that's the original message. It doesn't have to be text, it could be a picture, it could be a video. As we know from our experience so far in computing, when we send it over the network, it is going to be, just like everything else, a series of bytes. So when we're talking about encryption, we are basically always talking about encrypting a series of bytes. So the plaintext is those original bytes, and the ciphertext is going to be the encrypted version of them. All right, a cipher is just a set of rules to modify the plaintext to make it unreadable. So a cipher is something like a math formula. It takes a input, produces an output. And encryption is the act of applying a cipher to some plaintext in order to generate the ciphertext, which are the encrypted bytes. So the final to be sent encrypted message we refer to as the ciphertext. And of course, decryption is the reverse, using the cipher in order to restore the original plaintext from the ciphertext. And in some encryption methods, the process, the set of rules to decrypt is different from the process to encrypt, and in some it is the same. So we'll look at that some more later. So what are the challenges of producing encryption today? Well, computers are very, very good at cracking code, and the processing power of them continues to grow every year. Sometimes it stagnates for about a decade, as we saw until somewhere about last year, where processing power basically was stagnant. There wasn't much improvement in the speed of processors in particular. There was a little bit of improvement in thermals and cost, but not too much improvement for almost a decade, really, in terms of the speed of processors. And then you see AMD come out with this generation, and they sort of leapfrog processor speeds. And now for the equivalent money, so for $100, you can buy substantially more processing power than you could buy, let's say, 3 years ago, right? So sometimes it's a leapfrogging thing, and we don't know how much processing power we're going to have in 10 years. Sometimes we have very minute improvements for a decade, and then we have a jump. And so we want to be able to create encryption that is not only unbreakable by computers today, but unbreakable by computers 50, 100 years from now. And we want to do this without making it run too slowly on the computers of today, because it's easy to make encryption that is extremely robust 100 years from now, 50 years from now, by making it extremely, extremely processing intensive, but then it's not going to work on our stuff today, so there's a trade-off there. The biggest challenge in terms of network programming and encryption is that the communication, all of the communication between the client and the server, happens over a public channel between strangers. All of the routers along the way can't be trusted. All the different institutions that forward traffic can't be trusted. You could have rogue agents, hackers, or whatever at any different point along the way. You could have the state at any different point along the way. Remember, the state even fishes fiber optic cables up from the bottom of the sea and puts their little tap in them so they can see everything that comes in and out, right? They can do all these different things, so you know that there are always going to be people listening to the traffic along the way, and that includes the part where you exchange the keys. When we talk about online services, you don't exchange your keys, your security keys, in advance. You don't drive down to your friend Bob's house and write down a different password that you're both going to use. No, that happens over a public channel. And so we need to be able to set up a secure encrypted communication line over a channel that is completely public, where we cannot trust all the different intermediaries along the way. To some extent, encryption needs to be able to withstand physical access. But again, we do have this saying, I might have said it before, is that physical access is total access. And so generally speaking, once a hacker has physical access to your system, there's pretty much nothing you can do. However, there is something you might be able to do in terms of keeping your files from being read. And good encryption mechanisms are able to withstand physical access, including low-level hardware access. So there are still some cases in the United States, for example, of people who are still sitting in prison, but not convicted of some horrible crime like child pornography or terrorism or whatever they happen to be accused of, because their phone or hard drive or whatever is so well encrypted that authorities are not able to access it. So there are such different mechanisms of encryption, but many of these rely on you being able to store the password in your head. In practice, encryption usually does not withstand physical access unless the password is stored inside your head. So also, how can you trust the encryption algorithm? Again, how do you know that it comes from a reliable source? How do you know that it works? And how do you know that it doesn't have a backdoor, or that it's manufactured by the CIA or whatever? Generally speaking, you don't, and you just sort of hope for the best. So in that place, we all have to be a little bit optimistic, because there's not a whole lot we can do. So a couple simple ciphers, some historical ciphers. First, we've got the Caesar or the shift cipher. In this, the formula is to shift each letter by some number. So if we make a shift of 3, then A shifts over 3 spaces to the right, becomes a D, B becomes an E, and then if you get to the end of the alphabet, you wrap back around, so Z becomes a C. This is a very straightforward cipher. The cipher is encrypted by shifting 3 units to the right, obviously, and then to decrypt it, you would simply shift 3 units to the left, right? So you would just take each letter that you get and apply the shift, and shift so many to the left. Now, of course, it's very easy to get the plaintext here if you've kept the spacing and everything, obviously. So if you're doing this kind of cipher and you want any kind of, any kind of resistance against even casual observation. This is basically a game, right? People do these kinds of word scrambles all the time. So you would at least include space in your character. So in addition to the alphabet, you might capture other characters. Then you have your Virginia or Gransfield cipher. These were invented by different folks at different times, so they both get credit for them because they're similar. In this case, you do a Caesarean shift for each letter. That means that there is a different shift for each letter. So when you transmit a Virginia or a Gransfield message, you have to include the ciphertext as well as a shift text, basically. So you're including a text that's as long as your key is, or as long as your plaintext is, you are also including that. But in order to make it a little bit shorter, what they do is that they have a key that repeats. So you do in my example here, every 4 characters are done using the encryption key 1, 2, 3, 4, and that repeats over and over again. So to transmit hello, H+1, E+1, L+3, L+4, and then you restart and do O+1 and repeat, so on and so forth. So that makes you not have to transmit this very long key in addition to this very long plaintext. So you already see a little bit of network optimization going on with something as simple as the Virginia cipher. You don't want to have to transmit a key that is as long as the plaintext, so you make sure that the key repeats. This also creates a very obvious weakness in these kinds of ciphers because the key is repeating. It is very easy to, by observation, determine the key. Once you've determined the length of the key, which is not particularly easy to do if you don't know it, but once you've determined it by just casual observation, you can test it on 5, on 6. Once you've figured out maybe one word in the plaintext, it's much easier to do that. That's a kind of attack called a known plaintext. Once you've done that, you can usually extract the key pretty easily, so not a very good cipher either. Neither of these are good ciphers, but they were used historically thousands of years, hundreds or thousands of years ago, for our ancestors to encrypt their different important information. It's an example of a Vigenère tabula recta, because in Vigenère you typically send, instead of as numbers, your key as a word or as letters. So if I wanted to encrypt hello, I would find the H, then I would find the C, and I would know that I needed to send a J. And then if I wanted to send the E, I'd find the E, and then I'd find the A, and I need to send an E. And then if I'm decrypting, I do this in reverse. So if I just got a J, I'm going to find a J, then I'm going to find the C, and that's an L. Anyway, it's something like that. Doesn't particularly matter. We're not going to do it in this class. So before we get into actual cryptography, encryption, and decryption, first we're going to talk about hashes and salts, which are used very heavily in different encryption algorithms. And almost every discussion of proper encryption standards begins with first salt and hash your keys a bunch of times. You'll see this in many different encryption techniques. The 100 is obviously a hyperbole, but you will see a lot of salt and hashing required before you do anything with the encryption step. So let's talk about hashing first. If you haven't yet had hashing in 328, this should be a quick rundown for you. The kind of hashing that is used for cryptography is a little bit different from the kind of hashing that is used for, let's say, hash maps and stuff like that. In cryptography, the priority lays on getting outputs that are very, very unique. In hash maps and such, this is important, but it's not as important. The priority is usually more on getting the hash to evaluate quickly, and there's also not generally this requirement that the hashes have to come out to a fixed length. So in a hash map, you might get single-digit, double-digit, triple-digit outputs. This is one way you could still implement it. But in cybersecurity, what you are trying to do is map a small amount of data into an often larger amount of data. So you are trying to build a hash out of a usually larger quantity of data. A hash is a one-way mathematical function, so that the original is irrecoverable. So once you hash something, you're not able to unhash it. And the output that you're supposed to generate when you do this, again, is supposed to be very, very unique. So if I hash a message, there is no other message that produces that output. That would be ideal. In practice, this isn't possible, but we want for every message there to be basically one unique hash. And again, for cryptography, usually the hashes are generated with a fixed length, so the output is always the same length. This is why it's not possible for the first bullet to be the case. If we have a hash that's, let's say, 24 bits long, and we're able to hash any possible message in the universe, of course there are way more than 2 to the 24th messages in the universe, so we will have many, many messages that, even though they are completely different, end up producing the same output when they are hashed. So they're not completely unique, but they're unique enough, generally speaking. So a couple popular examples are SHA-1 and MD5. I think there's a newer version of SHA. I think we're up to like SHA-3 or something. And MD5 is still fairly popular, but some people take issue with it as well. You can find calculators online to do those and other hashing algorithms for you. You just paste your plaintext in, and it'll give you the SHA or the MD5 output. So when you store passwords on a computer, when you're storing passwords on your server, they should always be stored as a hash. That means that even if the database of those passwords is captured, it is not possible, again, because hashes are one way to recover the original passwords. And so you should always store your passwords as hashes. In my opinion, you should also always transmit passwords over the network as hashes. So you should always perform the hash on the client side and transmit it over the network as a hash. That means that if the network communication is compromised somehow, then you are still not revealing the password over the network. So I think you should do that as well. That's a less common practice. Hashing is primarily used for securing repetitive or similar data and for validating messages, but it also has many, many uses. Now remember, as I said before, that there are infinite messages that people can type. There are infinite different plaintexts, but there are not quite infinite hashes because they are fixed length. So it is possible for two plaintexts to generate the same hash. This is called a collision, and collisions are barely useful in forgery. They are somewhat useful, but they're not very useful, because let's say I have a plaintext, and I want to trick somebody into thinking that you had actually a different message. Let's say my plaintext was, "We attack at midnight." I put it through the hash, it produces some output. I want to trick you into attacking at a different time. Although it is possible for me to find another plaintext that generates the same hash, the odds that it's going to be a valid English expression that translates to something like "we attack at a particular time" is essentially zero. And that's why the collisions are barely useful, because even though you might be able to find some plaintext that generates the same output, the odds of it being an English expression that's useful to you are very, very low. So that's why collisions, again, they do come into play occasionally, but they're not the most important thing in cybersecurity. So let's give an example of a one-way irreversible process. Let's say we want to hash the message "hello." We just take the numerical value of each letter and add them together. That gives us 52. If I gave you 52 and asked you what word did I hash this out of, there would be no way for you to tell me that it was "hello," because there are infinitely many different series of characters that would sum to 52, right? There are probably at least, a million such combinations, and all of them are equally valid. So there's no way to reconstruct "hello" from 52. This is irreversible. That's not a good hashing algorithm because it has lots of collisions, though, right? There are many different things that evaluate to 52. So the summing all the letters together is a very bad hashing algorithm for that reason. Any set of characters that add to 52 would be considered a collision. This brings us to magical rainbow tables, just normally known as rainbow tables. So if you have a database of hashed passwords, if you're a hacker, you've stolen a database of passwords, and you just have the hashes, well, you could try to hash every possible combination of characters in the English language from the minimum length to the maximum length and see if the resulting hash matches any of the ones you have in your database. This would take you a very, very long time to do because there are many different combinations of characters in the English language. But most people don't use random combinations of characters for their passwords. They use words and expressions, special symbols. They have patterns that they fall into when they use those symbols and such. So what hackers realize is that you could keep a large table that maps passwords to their hashes, and you can make that table as big as you would like. So the largest rainbow tables are many, many terabytes big. And basically at that point you are trading off memory for processing power. Instead of having to compute the hash of every possible password, you just check if it exists in your rainbow table. And if you have a match, then you have found the user's actual original password as well. So you are searching their table to find a match. Now that you also have their plaintext, the user's password is revealed. They are, as we say, pwned, and you can use that password on their service that you hacked, as well as any other service where they've used the same password. And it is because of rainbow tables, basically, that we came up with salting. So again, a rainbow table, you have already hashed a bunch of passwords, let's say millions and millions and millions of the common passwords. And so you have two columns, the password and the hash that it results in. And then if you hack a bunch of password hashes somewhere, you simply compare them all against your table and see if you have any hits. And this makes you not have to compute every possible hash from A up to Z, of which there are very, very many, not even counting special characters and digits and all that stuff. So in salting, before we do the encryption, we add a little bit more data to the plaintext. That's basically it. So we generally make this data randomly generated or based on the user's username or their IP address or something that is specific to them that we expect them to come back with the next time. So we append our plaintext with the salt and then hash them both and store only that result. And now if you were trying to build a successful rainbow table, you would also have to account for every possible salt, and this is basically impossible. The caveat to this is that now you must also store the salts somewhere. So now in addition to storing the hash password, you also have to keep the user's salt somewhere, because every time the user reconnects, you need to be able to use that same salt on their plaintext. So you need to have the same salt available to you. So what many different encryption mechanisms that have a salt will do is they will append the salt to the ciphertext as they transmit it over the network. So the salt is generally not considered particularly private. It's not something that you would just reveal willingly, but it's also not something that is a tragedy if it is revealed, because it doesn't have any sensitive information. It's basically just generated, and so there's nothing really serious there. The worst case that happens if your salts leak is that you have to regenerate a bunch of salts for all your users using some different approach, and that's not a big deal. So for example, if we want to send the message hello, and we have a salt of cake 345345, when we go to hash the message, we will just append our salt of cake 345345 to hello and hash that whole thing. And why do we do that? Well, because it makes food taste better, and it also avoids ever having the same hash. So consider that instead of hello, we had two idiots that used the password. How could you, John Podesta? And then we give them different salts based on their username or some randomly generated number that we've, again, kept. So we're not randomly generating this each time, just initially. I'll be clear on that. So if we hash the expression password, we would get the same result for both users because they had the same password. But if we hash password 345345, then we get that first MD5 hash that I put there, the one that starts with D947. Whereas when we hash password 578345, we get a completely different MD5 hash, the one that starts with C63. So just by adding the salt, we've made them generate a different hash. Now you can't just search your rainbow table for what hash corresponds to password. All right, that brings us to real encryption. We're done with the hashing and the salting. Any questions on hashing and salting before we move on to actual encrypting? Any questions on hashing and salting? Either chat. While I wait for any questions that might come up, let me mention again that there's a different kind of hashing, slightly different kind of hashing, very similar mechanisms, just slightly different priorities for things like your hash maps and stuff. Those try to bind an input, the key, to, generally speaking, an index. So they simulate basically an array of some kind. And when you provide them the key, they compute the index really, really quickly, and then you can locate the value almost instantly. So you don't have to search for the array, you just have to compute the hash of the key, and then you know exactly where to look for the value. That's the basis of those kinds of hash maps. So their goal is not to generate something with a fixed length output, but to very, very quickly evaluate the key into a location. And although you do care about entries being unique in a hash map, you are able to handle collisions. So hash maps in Java and every other language, generally speaking, are able to handle collisions. Somehow they become slower as they accumulate more collisions, but they do not fail. So although we are a little bit leery of collisions, we're less leery in that context. And we don't have to have those fixed length outputs, otherwise pretty much the same. All right, so no questions about hashes and salts. Let's move on to encryption. First, is there such a thing as an unbreakable encryption? Yes, there is. There is the one-time pad. A one-time pad is a prearranged set of characters that we are going to XOR against the plaintext. What do I mean by prearranged? Let's say that you and I are spies, and I'm going to send you to the front. Before I send you off, I'm going to give you a bunch of pads of paper that have a bunch of randomly generated characters. They have to be random. A non-randomly generated one-time pad could be cracked. But let's say you had some randomly generated characters, and I send you off to the front with that sheet of randomly generated characters. And when you need to send me a message, you just read, let's say you need to send me a message of 6 characters. You read the first 6 characters from your sheet, XOR them with the 6 characters you want to send, and send them to me. I have a copy of the same sheet. I can decrypt them. Nobody else can. This is an unbreakable encryption mechanism because every other possible 6-character message is equally viable without knowing those randomly generated characters that I've XORed against. So if an attacker manages to gain control of the ciphertext here, they have no idea which 6-character message it is. It could be any 6-character message. The biggest weakness here, of course, is that if your pad is compromised, it's gone forever. And of course, everything can be cracked if your pad is compromised. That means that you have to send the pad to, in my case, we exchanged pads before one of the spies departed for the front, right? But you can't possibly exchange pads over an unsecure internet where you don't trust anybody along the way, right? Everybody can just read your pad. So of course this is pretty useless for network programming. You don't see one-time pads used at all. And in fact, you don't really see one-time pads used in computing at all for this particular weakness. It's where do you keep the pad? Well, the pad's always insecure, so pretty useless in this case. Good for spies, not great for cryptography. And then another weakness is that you can never reuse the pads because just basic math, XOR 2 ciphers with the same pad, and you've extracted the pad, which means you can decrypt both messages. That's not good. So you can never reuse your pads. That means when you run out, you can no longer send encrypted messages. Not good at all. And of course, you need a prearranged exchange of pads again, and they need to be the same on both sides. So is unbreakable, but still not useful in practice. That brings us to the first of the two different kinds of encryption that are typically used. So, as we get into this, I will link in the discussions on Canvas another book on cryptography if you're interested in learning more. It's an online book, and it covers all of the different topics that we're going to look at in more detail. We are not going to touch on cryptography too much. We are just here to learn the terms so that we can utilize them over our network programming, because we trust the encryption algorithms that others have made. We don't need no fancy self-made encryption. And with that, by the way, let me issue my first warning of never try to make your own cryptography. Okay, just use what's available in your programming language, in your environment. Do not roll your own crypto. Do not do it. You will make a mistake. It will be bad. Do not do it. Use the libraries and stuff that are available to you to implement your own. All right, back to the lesson. So, symmetric encryption is sometimes also called secret key encryption because both parties share a single secret key. And this is the kind of encryption that we are used to in the real world. When you lock your front door, you lock it with the same key that you use to unlock it, right? So it's the same key both ways. It's used slightly differently. You turn it left instead of right, but it's the same algorithm. You put your key in the door and you turn it and it locks or it unlocks. Pretty much everything is like that. Your car key, you have a lock button and an unlock button, but it's the same key and it's the same function, basically. You just push a button. So those are all examples of symmetric encryption, because the way you lock them and the way you unlock them is the same. So the key used for encryption and decryption is the same. And popular examples include DES, AES, newer algorithms like blowfish. Symmetric encryption is quite useful, not as useful as asymmetric encryption, which we'll look at after, but it's still quite used today. What are the typical uses of symmetrical encryption? Well, you would definitely use this to encrypt property that is in your physical possession. So your hard drive, your phone, these kinds of things are typically encrypted using symmetric encryption, and then the key must be stored in a secure place. The most secure place that there is your mind. A lot of people like to rely on biometrics, such as fingerprints and that sort of thing, but if you are assuming that the state is one of the people that can get your stuff and do nasty things with it, then fingerprints are pretty useless, because if the state ever arrests you, it's very easy for them to take your finger. Not cut it off, just make you touch the screen with it, right? Or they can also cut it off. But any kind of biometric sort of thing can always be compromised by somebody simply compelling you to give it to them. Whereas if the key is in your mind, it all depends on your ability psychologically to withstand whatever it is that they throw on you, and how willing the state is basically to torture you. And if the key is in your mind and your device has some kind of functionality, such as it will wipe completely after 5 attempts, which many particularly secure devices have some sort of functionality like that, all you have to do is trick your captors a certain number of times, and then it's all over anyway, right? So depends on what you've got. But in less extreme cases, the key is stored on a tamper-proof chip somewhere on the device. This has been the trend for a while now, the use of the tamper-proof chips. We've seen things like the trusted protection module built into processing chips all around the world. It is a very small tamper-proof chip somewhere on the processor, not located in the same place as everything else. It's usually glued on to the die in such a way that any attempt to remove it or mess with it will break it. And it is pretty much completely defeats any kind of amateur attack. The only way for a tamper-proof chip to be compromised is by a very elaborate state actor that has the tools to extract it without breaking it, which is not something that you would expect any hacker to be able, any individual hacker or small organization to be able to do, because they are so, tiny, and you need specialized equipment. So unless there is a software-based glitch in them, an exploit of some sort, these tamper-proof chips are a really good way to keep symmetric encryption keys secure. And so we'll look at an example a little bit later of a tamper-proof chip implemented in a modern device, but these are pretty popular. And then sometimes the key is stored off the device somewhere. This makes it so that if the device is compromised, well, the attacker also needs to compromise this off-device storage, which if it's in the cloud, it's probably password secured. So this gives you an extra layer of protection that the attacker needs to compromise both your physical device and whatever cloud or off-device storage you have for your key. But if you have a copy of the symmetric encryption key for a ciphertext somewhere in the same place as the ciphertext, then it is completely worthless. And this is why symmetric encryption is such a big problem for us as developers. But we'll look at that next time. That's all we've got for today. If you are considering using encryption to beat one of your different homework assignment tasks this week, I highly encourage it, and you can easily discover any of the common encryption libraries and how to use them in Java online and in your textbook. Plenty of examples in both places. Okay, thanks for tuning in, guys. I will see you later this week.